Quick show of hands. How many remember from the time when you were children on, say, a big Thanksgiving dinner or a Christmas dinner being assigned a seat at the kids' table? Almost everybody here had to sit at... Sandy Miller, you never had to sit at the kids' table? You probably got a table just to yourself. You remember kids' tables and grown-ups' tables, and the grown-up table, that's where all the civilized conversation took place, and people used silverware, and they ate off the fine china, and maybe they used crystal water glasses when they drank their water. The kids' table, there was nothing civilized about the conversation at the kids' table, at least when my brothers were, when I were sitting there. In fact, our conversations usually involved like taking carrot sticks and sticking them between the pinch, between your front teeth and your front lip, and making a little walrus images. Hey, look at me, guys, I'm a walrus. It's not surprising they put us at the kids' table, is it? I remember one time my brother put a pea in his nose and then pretended to sneeze. You know how that works. Thus, the kids' table. I remember visiting my grandparents one Thanksgiving, and my grandparents didn't have a dining room. So the kids' table was actually set up in the kitchen with the grown-ups' table. And it was a folding, card table, black metal table. And some of you may have seen one, maybe still have one. It's kind of a reddish vinyl top. And the kids sat at that rickety table, and the grown-ups sat up at one of those kind of silvery white Malamite chairs with the vinyl seats. And well, you could tell right away what my grandparents thought of my aunt's new boyfriend by where they placed him at the table. See, he didn't get to sit at the grown-ups table. They put my aunt's new boyfriend at the kids' table with all of us. You could just read what the pecking order in this family was. There was Grandma and Grandpa, there was my parents, there was my aunts, there was the kids, and the new boyfriend at the kids' table. Ever since that time, I've been thinking about how table sort of symbolizes the pecking order in our world. How we can spot very quickly the divisions of power and privilege in our world by where someone sits at the table. What your role is at the table. Did any of you ever have a jump seat at your table? You know what the jump seat is? That's the one who's sitting near the fridge, and your parents would say, hey, Marcus, would you jump up and get some more milk? Mark, would you jump up and get that pot off the stove and bring it over here? Would you jump up? I call that the jump seat. And if you ever happen to see that wonderful Cleveland Christmas movie called A Christmas Story, you might remember that scene where little Ralphie and his brother Randy and their dad are sitting at the kitchen table, and Mom's trying to serve up all the hot potatoes and the hot stew and everything. And then just when she was getting ready to sit down, her husband would say, honey, can you jump up and get me whatever? And honey, can you get me this? And then the kids would say, Mom, I need more milk. And Mom was always sort of jumping up and down. She was in the jump seat. Ralphie is grown up and narrating this movie Christmas Story as an adult. And I'll never forget what he said as his mom's jumping up and down, taking care of her family. He said, my mom had never eaten a hot meal herself in 15 years. That's the jump seat. And I imagine if you don't today, at one time you probably had a head of the table in your house. Anybody have a head of the table? Still have head of the table in your house. And the person at the head of the table is often the alpha in the family. It's usually the mother or the father sitting at the head of the table. And I didn't quite follow head of the table. In our house, we had a kind of almost like a picnic table with two long benches, monks' benches. And so, sometimes my father sat at the end, but head of the table was always shifting. I didn't really learn about it until I went over to Beth's house one day at lunch. We were just dating. We were in high school, grade 13 for any Canadians watching today. We said, let's go home for lunch. We went home. Her mom was there, and we decided we'd just make some sandwiches and stuff. And Beth's kitchen was very small, and her mom and Beth were having a good time making sandwiches, but I felt like I was in the way. So I slid around to one side of the table, out of their way, underneath the window and on the far side of the kitchen. I thought, great, I can enjoy this conversation, and I don't have to be tripping anybody up in the kitchen. was I'm sitting there in this table, I can see straight through the kitchen, through the dining room, to the front door and the driveway. And guess who I see pull in the driveway? It's her dad. He's come home for lunch unexpectedly. He comes through the door, he's chipper and smiling, and he comes into the kitchen, he looks at his wife Fern and gives her a kiss on the cheek. He says hi to Beth, and then he looks at me sitting at the table and sort of grunts. And then he turns to his wife Fern. He says, "Fern, grab your coat. I'm taking you out for lunch today. I'll meet you in the car." And he storms through the living room, slams the door, and then he goes back out to the car. And after Beth's mom left, I said, "What was that all about?" She said, "Oh, I should have warned you. You were sitting in his seat." You start to understand the divisions of power in a family, don't you? When you start to name who's sitting where, and sit in the seat of honor sometime, and you're going to find out what the pecking order is in that family. But you know, table has also revealed to us throughout time dominant caste and subservient caste. It's revealed to us who has power and privilege in this world and who does not. Not just in the family, but in this world. I've been reading Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent. And she was reflecting on a time in our not the long past, not too long ago here in the South, during the Jim Crow law times. She was talking about a time when if you were black in America, particularly in the South during the time of Jim Crow laws, you could eat in the same restaurant, you just had to come in through the back door, not the front door. Or you could eat in the same restaurant, but there was a place for the white folks and a place for the black folks. They used to call it separate but equal, but we know the truth, it was separate and not so equal all the time. But there was a place for one and a place for the other. The world found a way to divide us, to divide the dominant caste from the subservient caste. And Wilkerson talks about a time when the main form of travel in the late 1800s and the early 1900s was the river. We've got this wonderful Savannah River here. Nashville has its Cumberland River. A lot of people live along the Mississippi River. And people would travel on these river boats. Well, what do you do if you separated castes, those with power and privilege and those without, who can't sit at the table together? What do you do when you're on the same boat? Well, you have different seatings, don't you? The first seating went to the dominant class, to the white folks. They had what's called the captain's table. They ate at the first seating with the captain. The second seating did not go to emancipated slaves or the families of emancipated slaves. The second seating generally went to immigrants, to new Americans, my people, the Italians or the Irish, people who kind of came late in the game. They had the second seating because they weren't allowed to eat with the white folks. And you know there was a time when Italians and Irish in the South were kind of looked down upon. There were even lynchings of Italians in the South of the United States. I know this why? Because I've been learning about my family history. But they weren't allowed to sit with the white folks on the riverboat, and they did not want to sit with the black folks on the riverboat. Why? Because they're trying to separate themselves from the lower caste. They don't want to be identified with that group. They're trying to rise up in the world. They're trying to make it up into that dominant caste, the white folks. And guess what? A lot of us have. We're very proud of our Irish culture here in Savannah, aren't we? We weren't always so sure about it. And now, oh my goodness, there is a pastor at the Montgomery Presbyterian Church whose last name ends in a vowel. So somehow those Italians and those Irish, they managed to get up there into that dominant caste. The third seating went to emancipated slaves, people who were free, or their families, the children of slaves who are now free. They got the third seating. No one else wanted to sit with them, and they weren't allowed to sit with other people. But you know what? There was a fourth seating. It was still the lower caste. It was still African Americans, but it was African Americans who'd risen up in class. They were still of that subservient caste, African American, But they started to succeed. They started to own businesses and started to save money and invest. And they started to dress quite nicely like the white folks did. But they did not want to sit with the African Americans who hadn't risen. They didn't want to be associated with that. And the white folks didn't want them sitting with them. And the Italians and the Irish didn't want those who were rising up to be with them because they were trying to distinguish themselves from that caste. It's remarkable how we use dining and our tables to divide up powers, to divide up the dominant caste, the subservient caste, and everybody in between. It's all done at table. And if you think we've come a long way from that, we have to a certain degree. But you know what? I bet you have African American friends who will tell you that there are times they will go out to a restaurant and they will either get slow service or no service. People will tell you they'll go into a restaurant and they'll serve the white folks first and kind of be slow to attend the black folks. I'm not even sure the servers are aware that they're doing it. That happened to me and a friend of mine in Montreal one night. We'd gone out to a restaurant and late at night, and the only other people in the restaurant was this black couple who came in at the same time as us. We sat down. The server came over, brought our bread and our water and took our orders and brought us menus and brought us a drink when we ordered a drink. I didn't see what was going on over my shoulder, and I'm looking at my friend, and he's sort of growling about what he's seeing. And I said, "What's going on? What's the problem?" He said, "That waiter's totally ignoring that black couple over there." I said, "Come on." This time it was like 1990. Come on, really, in 1990? And I turned around. We'd come in at the same time. We had bread on our table. We had water. We'd been served a glass of wine. We had our menus, and we're considering what we might have for a late night meal. And I look over my shoulder, and there's not even a glass of water on the table of that African American couple. My buddy says to me, "Let's get out of here. I'm not eating here. If they're not going to serve that couple, then they're not going to serve us. Let's go." We walked out, stormed out. I wish, looking back on it, I wish we'd actually talked to the server or the manager and say, "Look, this is not fair. This is not just. You're using table to divide us by race." But we did get halfway down the street, and I said, "Hey, buddy, you forget, we didn't pay for our drinks. We just walked out on the whole situation." Table is often used to divide people and to divide us up by caste, to divide us up by ethnicity, to divide us up by race and by nation. No clearer was it internationally. Some of you remember all too well that back when we were trying to end the Vietnam War, that it took a full 8 or 9 months to get everybody to the table to have peace talks. Why? Because they couldn't agree on who'd sit at the head of the table and who'd sit at the side. It was a rectangle table, and of course we're the United States of America. We want to be at the head of the table, and so did Vietnam and South Vietnam, and so did China. Everybody wanted the place of power at the table, and very few were willing to sit at the side. And the whole time that nations are arguing over their power, trying to assert themselves, American soldiers are dying, as were Vietnamese soldiers dying in the jungles of Vietnam for 8 or 9 months, until finally some brainiac comes up with the idea. You all remember, some of you served in Vietnam. Exactly. Sandy just made a circle sign. Till somebody said, "Why don't we have a round table?" At a round table, nobody's in a seat of power, nobody's in a dominant caste, and nobody's in a subservient caste. We are one at the table. Well, why am I bringing this up today? Well, it's World Communion Sunday. And we are people who gather around a round table, metaphorically. I wish our communion table was round when you think about it. We worship a God, Jesus Christ, who came into this world to round the table of God's grace, to shave off the corners, to shave away the head of the table and the least spot at the table, and to say nobody's going to sit at the kids' table, nobody's going to sit at the grown-ups' table. We're all going to sit at God's round table of grace. Jesus spent the entire part of his ministry trying to tear down those worldly divisions, the divisions that the powers and principalities were setting up. Where they built walls, he was tearing them down. Where they were chaining people in slaves, he was breaking those chains. He was crossing all sorts of lines to reach people, to let them know about this amazing grace of God that was for them too. He crossed the lines that divide nations. He ministered to other nations. He crossed lines of ethnicity. He crossed lines of gender. He crossed lines of religion and creed. He crossed all the lines to show people that they were welcome at God's table of grace. He was rounding the table, so to speak. Everybody would be invited to the table of grace in Jesus Christ. You know who didn't want to come to the table of God's grace? Those people who had power, those who were part of the Roman Empire, and those within the original religious establishment who were used to living at the top, and they're thinking, wait a minute, a round table? If we have a round table, I can no longer sit at the head of the table. If you're inviting sinners and tax collectors and prostitutes and foreigners and Samaritans, how am I going to continue to assert my power? How am I going to continue to hold on to my dominance in my organized religion, in my Roman Empire? You know, Jesus told a parable in Matthew's gospel about a banquet, a wedding banquet. And in this story, everybody gets invited to the wedding banquet. But all along the way, people keep coming up with excuses of why they can't come. I just got married, and I got to take care of the marriage, and I've got a farm, I got to take care of the farm. And I'm thinking to myself, as a kid, as a youngster, I used to think, oh, this is a parable about us not finding excuses to come to the table of God's grace. But the older I get, the more I start realizing that maybe, just maybe, the excuses were being used so that people who were up here in dominant class or dominant caste didn't have to come down to a round table. Those who were used to being at the head of the table didn't want to come down and sit at a round table. I don't know how many of you remember back in Sunday school days, or I remember church camp, learning a song about that parable called I Cannot Come to the Banquet. Do you remember that song? It goes, I cannot come to the banquet, don't bother me now. I have married a wife, I have bought me a cow. I have fields and commitments that cost a pretty sum. Pray hold me excused, I cannot come. And of course, as kids, you know, we tried to make it a little more entertaining. We broke every social rule, we were like entirely politically incorrect. And we'd start singing it this way. I cannot come to the banquet, don't trouble me now. I have bought me a wife, I have married a cow. But you know what? Even though we were politically incorrect, even though we spun it around, we still remembered it. I still remember it today. It stuck. Just like Jesus' parable has stuck with me. Just like Paul's teaching to the Galatians has stuck with me all these years. In fact, I was thinking, what if we rewrote that song for our day and age? Now that we've moved a little further away from the agrarian culture, the agrarian age, farming, and farming now is a very corporate thing here in America. I wonder if the song today might go something like this. I cannot come to the banquet, don't trouble me now. I have great big investments in the NASDAQ and the Dow. I've got a house in the Hamptons, a beach house in the sun. Buy Beamers in the shop, I cannot come. And you know what, though? The invitation keeps coming, doesn't it? Jesus keeps calling, keeps inviting us to be a church of the round table. You know, the Apostle Paul said, if you're a baptized Christian, all those worldly divisions that get imposed upon us, all those ways that the powers and principalities seek to separate us, they get washed away. He said we have a new identity in Jesus Christ. And in Christ there is no more Jew, there is no more Gentile, there is no more slave, there is no more free, there's no more male, there's no more female. And I suppose if we wanted to contextualize it for our day and age, we could also say there's no more Republican and there's no more Democrat. There's no more right-wing or left-wing, no more alt-right, no more alt-left. There's no more Proud Boys and there's no more Antifa. If you're a baptized Christian, you're now one in Jesus Christ, and you're all invited to this round table of God's grace. There's room for each and every one of you. I think about that and the day and age we live in, where constantly we are bombarded with messages that somehow we're divided, that somehow we are a divided people or a divided nation. And I don't believe it. Because I come here to the Montgomery Presbyterian Church every Sunday, and I know the kind of hospitality and welcome that happens here in this church. I've seen it with my own eyes. I've known it for 2 decades, how welcoming this church is to people of different gender, of different color, of different ethnicity and background. Who is this Canadian preacher whose last name ends in a vowel that's standing in the pulpit of the Montgomery Presbyterian Church in Old Montgomery preaching? Tell me that's not one of the greatest signs of hospitality and welcome you've ever seen. And not only in this church do people get welcome no matter who they are, but people who are apparently, seemingly different are not only welcomed into our pews for worship, but we have shared power and leadership in this church. We've lifted them up to be ordained deacons and ordained elders in this church. We've shared leadership. That's what it is to be a round table congregation. And I believe on days like today, World Communion Sunday, as we remember who we are as baptized Christians, one in Jesus Christ, I don't think Paul is asking us to deny our uniqueness, to deny the identity we bring to the body. Paul's not asking me to forget that I was once of an Italian ancestry or that my mother's Canadian. He's not asking me to forget that. He's not asking me to forget the joy I have in rock and roll music because it seems worldly or secular. No, I think Paul's asking us as baptized Christians to bring that uniqueness to the table, that we might form this incredible mosaic of God's grace, and that we might show it, let it shine out for the world, so that when the world seeks to divide people, we can say, no, we've got another way. We want to show you a table that's round. You know, we sing another song in the church, don't we? Sang it as a kid, we've sang it here at Montgomery Presbyterian Church. And it seems a far more worthy song to sing on World Communion Sunday than I Cannot Come. We are one in the Spirit. We are one in the Lord. We are one in the Spirit. We are one in the Lord. And we pray that unity might one day be restored. And how will the world know us, this people of the round table? And they'll know we are Christians by our love, by our love. Yes, they'll know we are Christians by our love. Love shaves off the corners, doesn't it? Love erases head of the table and jump seat and grown-up table and kids' table. Love rounds it out and welcomes all into our hearts, into our church, and into this world. We can't live by the world's false narrative that somehow we are divided. Brothers and sisters, we are one in Jesus Christ. Please, praise be to God.